where
This
we
conference
left
will
off
now be recorded.
in the last class. Okay, so I think we were just telling about these tests, like different caloric tests like Coprac test, Fitzgerald Hall Pike test, and cold air caloric test. Okay, and I think we had discussed about this also, interpretations and all. I have told you. So next is the electronystagmography. Now, what happens key when you are doing a caloric test and when you are telling the patient to fix the what you say the vision to a particular point, no, then what happens key it suppresses the nystagmus to some extent, and in certain cases where the nystagmus is very mild, we may miss it also. So in those conditions, we can go for a electronystagmography. So, so it is nothing but the main principle is the chorioretinal potential difference. So the cornea, corneoretinal potential difference. The cornea is a positive charge compared to the retina. So this is the principle which is used, and what it does keep you place a number of electrodes above, around the eye, and a ground electrode over the center part of the forehead, and then you can do the test, and the main the main advantage is you can document it. Okay, and also you can analyze the eye movement and assess labyrinthine function and degree of dysfunctions also. Okay, so method of detecting and recording of mistakes. You have a record with you. Previously you don't have, you just observed, and then there is no record of that, but you can also keep a calorigram also. So it depends on presence of corneoretinal potential recorded by surface electrodes placed around the orbit. So I have told you that. So advantage, it detects fine nystagmus, which is not visible to naked eye. So the nystagmus is so fine that you can't record it, and then to detect nystagmus in the dark. So some if you make it totally dark, then we can't see, but it can be recorded with the help of a uh, electronystagmography. Disadvantage is it cannot record pure rotational eye movement. So, and other biological potentials can be picked up as an artifact like EEG. So, if you can recall back, like doing a BERA also, this other electrical activities in which are going on inside the brain can also be a hindrance to these electrical activity, because all will be taking place simultaneously. So you cannot negate completely the EEG activities of the brain. So aim is to find out if there is an abnormality of vestibulo-ocular system. So what are the aims of electronystagmography? So one, you establish whether there is abnormality of the vestibulo-ocular system. So if it is abnormal, whether it is a peripheral abnormality or a central abnormality, that is the first thing. And then if peripheral, then which side is involved? So whether it is involving the right or it is involving the left side. If central, whether it involves the cerebellum, the brainstem, or the cerebral cortex. And the lesion is static, progressive, or recovery. So all these information we can get from a electronystagmogram. So whether there is a first is to establish an abnormality, then to say whether it is peripheral or central, then to say if it is peripheral, which side is involved, then central means which part, and then whether it is an active lesion or it is static, progressive, or recovery. So the patient is instructed to avoid alcohol and certain drugs for at least 48 hours before the procedure. Ear examination should be done prior to the test. Electrodes are applied and the area is cleansed with spirit and alcohol so that the electrode gets in touch with the skin properly. The corneoretinal potential, so electrooculography depends upon that. There is a steady DC potential termed as corneoretinal potential. This potential, they create an electric field at the front of the head that rotates as the eye rotates. So these are the electrodes you can see, and to detect the various motions of the eyeball, one below the lower eyelid, one above, one on the lateral canthus on either side, and this is the ground electrode here. So patient is asked to follow a series of vertical stripes on a rotating drum. So if you see now, the like a drum will be there, and they will be having either if it is background is white, then black stripe, or if background is black, then white stripes will be there. And the rotation will be at a fixed cycles per minute. And when you see the drum rotating, no, so it produces the nystagmus, and this nystagmus, the slow component will be in the direction. If the drum is rotating clockwise, so in the direction of the moving stripe, and fast component in the opposite direction. So if it is a clockwise spin, then that will be in the direction of the movement of the drum. And abnormality also indicates a central lesion. So we can also know whether there is a central lesion present or not. Then a rotational test. So patient is seated in a Baranese revolving chair with head tilted 30 degrees forward and rotated 10 turns in 20 seconds. So this is fixed. The head is tilted 30 degrees forward and the chair rotates 10 turns in 20 seconds. The chair is stopped abruptly and nystagmus is observed towards the side of rotation. So normally the nystagmus lasts for 25 to 40 seconds. The advantage here is the test can be performed in case of congenital abnormalities where the semicircular canal failed to develop. So in those cases also you can find out. And disadvantage is both the labyrinths are simultaneously stimulated. So it is little bit difficult to isolate which side the pathology is. So this is the chair actually you can see. And here you have the patient is wearing the glasses, the Frenzel glass. So that avoids visual fixation, and then depends whether it can rotate clockwise or anti-clockwise. Galvanic test only tests which differentiates an end organ lesion from that of vestibular nerve. So here you see all these tests which we were doing here, we are testing the vestibulo-ocular reflex. But now here, the galvanic and all, you start with the vestibulo-spinal reflex. Okay, the posturography. So all these will test the vestibulo-spinal reflex. I don't want to go into the detail of this galvanic test and posturography. So you remember that posturography and the galvanic test, they test the vestibulospinal reflex, and rest all the tests which we had discussed till now, they are for the vestibulo-ocular reflex. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Acha, my voice is audible to everyone?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
No?
Yes, sir.
There is no lag, no? Okay. Now coming to disorders of vestibular system, you can see that it has been classified into a peripheral and central group. The peripheral group most commonly has BPPV. You have vestibular neuronitis, labyrinthitis, perilymphatic fistula, acoustic neuroma, Meniere's disease, trauma to the head, or using vestibulotoxic trauma means like say fracture of the temporal bone. Central lesion indicates vertebrobasilar insufficiency, migraine, cerebellar disease, multiple sclerosis, brain tumors, epilepsy, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery syndrome. So a big list is there. I have already pointed out few of this. So approach to a patient with dizziness. So they see the main problem with vertigo is it is a way people come with very vague complaint thinking that it is vertigo. But as a clinician, you should be able to uh, isolate which is a true vertigo. See here it is. See, patient comes. I am just dizzy. So this is ill-defined lightheadedness. So maybe a cause of psychiatric disorder like anxiety or depression. So this should be ruled out in history only. I might faint, I'm giddy, I'm lightheadedness. So this all suggests of syncope or near syncope, like blackouts. You ask the patient, are you having blackouts? And then syncope or near syncope, usually you go and search in the cardiovascular disorders like orthostatic hypotension or arrhythmias, etc. I might fall. So that indicates a disequilibrium. So, but here it is a non-vestibular neurologic disorder, which mostly points in the direction of cerebellum. So then, in this condition, you can start for cerebellar disorder and multiple sclerosis. I am tilting, rocking, the room is spinning, or I am spinning. This is the true vertigo. See, all here it is only one, it is written as vertigo. This is known as the true vertigo. Okay, and here mostly it is a vestibular disorder which can be maybe peripheral or central. So if it is peripheral, then it might be limited to the mid inner ear, and if it is central, then you go for retrocochlear, means the above the vestibular nucleus and above is called as the central disorder. Up to the level of vestibular nucleus is included in the peripheral disorder. Now all of you are clear regarding vertigo.
Yes, sir.
Huh? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Huh? So you can see, so you see
Yes, sir.
from history, taking a very careful history is the main trick in identifying a case of true vertigo and separating all other conditions which may appear similar to the patient but is quite different as a clinician for you. Okay, so depending on the duration, see time in, if it is in seconds, and if it is a peripheral one, then BPPV is the most likely diagnosis. So here you have to take the age of the patient also. BPPV usually occurs in elderly age group, and so this is, if it is central, then it is a vertebrovascular artery transient ischemia. Okay, so if it is in minutes, then mostly might be a perilimb fistula, or maybe centrally maybe a migraine aura. If sorry, if it is around half an hour to 1 hour, and then it might be Meniere disease. If it is a peripheral, or if it's central, might be a basilar migraine. If it is for days together, then definitely it is vestibular neuronitis or labyrinthitis, and here vertebrovascular stroke. And going into weeks or months, there may be acoustic neuroma or drug toxicity. In central region, you have multiple sclerosis and cerebellar degeneration. So also, depending on the duration of vertigo, classically also you can make the diagnosis from history. So a very, very important thing is, remember, is to take a very careful history. So a good history taking will almost solve 80 to 90% of the diagnosis. Rest all not much of investigation is required also. So this is the difference between the peripheral and central vertigo. Now coming to the nystagmus, the type of nystagmus is a combined horizontal and torsional. Here it is vertical is most common, maybe horizontal or torsional. Direction, the peripheral has fixed direction and central may change the direction. Visual fixation usually inhibits the peripheral. Nystagmus is suppressed if it is due to peripheral vertigo by visual fixation. But here, if it is due to central cause, then there is no effect of visual fixation on the nystagmus. Fatigability is present here in peripheral, absent in central. Latency is present in peripheral and absent in central. Imbalance, there is mild to moderate but still able to walk. But here in central vertigo, patient is severe and is unable to stand or walk. So most of them are bedridden, particularly if it is secondary to a cerebellar pathology. Nausea and vomiting are usually present and severe in peripheral vertigo, and it varies in central. Some cases there may not be at all any nausea or vomiting. Hearing loss and tinnitus are common in peripheral and they are rare in central vertigo. Neurologic disorders, that is motor and sensory deficiency, ataxia, Horner syndrome, are totally absent in peripheral but are present in central disorder because they they may be a syndrome complex of some peripheral of some central disease. Recovery in case of peripheral vertigo begins within few days, whereas in central it takes a lot of time. And head thrust sign is present and where it is absent in central vertigo. And these are the different causes. So then the Cawthorn and Kukese exercise, particularly for patients suffering from BPPV, it is just to remember this name, Cawthorn, Kukese, and these usually starts, if patient is having severe vertigo, then they are advised to do this in bed. Then if it improves, you can also first initially the eye movements, then the head movements, and then exercises sitting and gradually in standing posture. So this is a rehabilitation exercise, particularly most commonly works in case of BPPV and thereby helps in patient, helps in what you say, taking the patient out of drugs, particularly the labyrinthine sedatives and etc. So that finishes your uh, test for balance. Uh, any doubt you have, you can please ask. Any doubt? Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes,
Am
sir.
I audible? You have any doubt? Huh?
No, sir.
No, sir.
No. So we'll go ahead with this evaluation of a deaf child. Okay. So, so what is deafness? So it is a symptom rather than a definitive diagnosis, and it is important to identify the underlying cause and associated conditions, if any, as these may need their own management. So deafness is a symptom, but the cause, there are hundred of causes of for deafness. So children with profound deafness, which indicates more than 90 decibel loss or total deafness, fail to develop speech and have often been termed deaf mute or deaf and dumb. So particularly those who are born with this disability, those who are unfortunate, uh, unfortunately they've lost the ability to hear, can also lose the ability to speak also. So the period from birth to 5 years of life is critical for development of speech and language. And therefore, there is a need for early identification and assessment of hearing loss and early rehabilitation. So why this is essential? So if I say first 5 years of life is very critical. Why it is critical? This is because of neural plasticity. So this is the terminology used. This is called neural plasticity. So that is, plasticity means what? The ability of the neurons to adjust, the ability or the flexibility, you can say, of the neurons. So that goes off very fast. As the child grows older, the neural plasticity decreases. So if you don't do anything within the first 5 years of life, then after that, if whatever you do, it won't have that much effect, or the improvement or the results will not be that much encouraging, because the neural plasticity will be lost. So children whose hearing loss was observed and managed before 6 months of age had higher scores of vocabulary, better expressive and comprehensive language skill than those diagnosed and managed after 6 months of age. You see, so much difference is there. Even though you put in the same amount of effort, but because of this neural plasticity, the the child who was treated before the age of 6 months has a better outcome. Now, this is already we have discussed the hearing loss and all. I will not go into it. Now, coming to when a patient comes to you, the parents are very much anxious. They bring their child to you saying that this child is not listening and not listening to us, or even the mother calls, the child is not responding. So usually they come early, or some parents they come late. So whatever is the case, these are the under the following headings we have to do the follow the what you say the protocol. First is a good history, next followed by clinical examination, audiology, imaging, blood test, urine analysis, serology, ophthalmological assessment, ECG, and then genetic screening. So coming from the history, so history starts the day the child is conceived. So here, particularly the history of the mother during pregnancy, whether the lady had taken all the vaccinations or not, like for torch and for the tetanus toxoid. All these vaccines were given to the lady during her pregnancy or not. Number one. Number two is whether there is any history of infection by toxoplasmosis, rubella, cytomegalo, herpes type 1 and type 2, or even also syphilis. But nowadays it's very rare to find syphilis, but rest all can occur. So this is very critical because now everywhere the government is stressing pregnant expectant mother to go for a uh, uh, hospital delivery or institutional delivery, and even those who go for institutional delivery also are paid some incentives, so that will encourage others also to come forward. So very, very important. But still, even though government has given so many incentive but still people are getting delivered by local Dai in the villages. So where if then these all are very important for you, where the patient got delivered and what was the method, whether it was a CS delivery or it was a normal vaginal delivery. All this is very, very important here. Then I will go to that. Drugs during pregnancy. Whether any of the following drugs like streptomycin, gentamicin, tobramycin, amikacin, quinine, and chloroquine were given to a pregnant mother. They cross the placental barrier and damage the cochlea. This is very tricky actually. How to ask? Because most of the patient you will be seeing may a large bulk of it are illiterate, so they don't know. They go to local quack, and that fellow just pushes some medicines, and that's all. So exposure to quinine and chloroquine is very important. You should know your own local area, which area is endemic for malaria in the neighboring part. So if the patient hails from that area, then definitely you ask about quinine and chloroquine. So other this tobramycin, amikacin, gentamicin, streptomycin are all injectable. So you can ask if whether they have given any injection or not. So there are these are you have quinine tablet, you have chloroquine tablet, but these all are injections. They don't have any tablet form. So, and you ask them whether you have taken any injections or not, or given by any quack to you or not. Radiation to mother in the first trimester. So, like mostly X-ray done in the first trimester also has a significant role. Other factors like nutritional deficiency, diabetes, toxemia, and thyroid deficiencies. Maternal alcoholism is also teratogenic to the developing auditory system. All this should be. Then history of hypoxia should be explored in great detail. So this is where the delivery history comes. How much did the first phase of labor last? How much did the second phase last? Third, like this. So if it is a normal vaginal delivery, you should have all the details. You try to find it out, or you try to extract it from the patient. Very, very important. And so including the length of ventilation, blood gas, metabolic evidence of hypoxia, and evidence of any other neurological effects. So these all you will get only when the patient has delivered in an institution. But since in India, majority they go and get delivered in their respective houses. So where this you will not get, but you will have a rough estimate. You can ask how much time did the delivery last, or whether it was a prolonged delivery, labor you were in labor for a long period of time, or was there any problem during the labor. So normally, if it is a primigravida, then obviously it will take a long time. But if it is a multigravida, then the what you say the period of delivery duration comes down little. Although hypoxia alone does not cause isolated sensorineural loss, but there is recent evidence that cochlear cell death can occur without evidence of hypoxic brain injury. So this is because the cochlea, the artery supplying the cochlear artery is a branch of anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So AICA, AICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this is a terminal, this is an end branch. So cochlear artery. So then already the what you say the blood supply to the inner ear rests only on a terminal branch. So if there is any hypoxia, then definitely if there is a spasm of the cochlear artery, then totally the oxygen supply will be cut off. Then history of the prematurity. So whether the child was born at term or well before term, and low birth weight, born before term or with birth weight less than 1500. So these are all risk factor actually. So these all you should, if you're good enough, and in your locality you can prepare a form beforehand, and you just ask and go on. You can tick the boxes instead of jotting down all the points. You have a ready-made form with you. You just tick the boxes. Forceps delivery nowadays very rarely it is done, but still some cases if it is used, there is a chance of intracranial hemorrhage with extravasation of blood into the inner ear. So forceps delivery can also cause facial nerve paralysis also. So you can search for that also. If the patient is having a child is having a facial nerve palsy on one side, it might be due to forceps delivery also. Sorry. Neonatal jaundice, very important. Bilirubin level greater than 20 milligram percentage damages the cochlear nuclei. So neonatal jaundice history should be sought after also. Neonatal meningitis and sepsis are also should be asked. So neonatal meningitis, this is simple way you can ask if it is a institutional delivery, whether the child was kept in a ICU. For if the child is kept in ICU, then definitely then you ask for how many days, whether it was a routine checkup in the ICU or there was some problem with the child when the child was born. They will give you all the history, but the main thing is you have to ask the right question. So you see, babies admitted to NICU for more than 48 hours were 10 times more likely to have permanent hearing loss than those who did not undergo ICU. So here why? Because particularly injectable antibiotics are used. So like amikacin, very commonly used in ICU. So if amikacin is used, then definitely there is chance of developing permanent hearing loss. Hyperbilirubinemia is an independent risk factor for sensory neural hearing loss in infants. So, high level of unconjugated bilirubin have been associated with neuronal damage, so particularly to the what is it, the cochlear nuclei. So, other causes you can say mostly bacterial meningitis, mumps, measles, trauma, ototoxic drug, and head injury. So mumps, measles, so we are giving vaccines to the child. So the prevalence of mumps, measles have also come down very drastically, but not bacterial meningitis. Meningitis is still quite common. So in fact, it is the most common cause of acquired hearing loss in childhood, that is bacterial meningitis. The risk of developing significant sensorineural impairment after bacterial meningitis has been estimated at approximately 10%. So, so the meningitis also leads to what it does. If the patient has a meningitis, now after meningitis, what happens? There occurs severe uh, bone formation. So what happens is that in cases of meningitis who develop what you say sensory neural hearing loss, in those patients you have to immediately do a cochlear implant surgery. Otherwise, the whole the oval window and all will become, or the scala vestibuli, the scala media, scala tympani, particularly the scala vestibuli, will become, sorry, the scala tympani will become totally obliterated by reactionary bone formation. Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So the post meningitis, no, is the only condition where you have to go for urgent cochlear implant. Otherwise, the scala tympani will close off permanently. and then even you can't do a cochlear implant. So measles, as it was known that mucous membrane all over the body were affected, the observed hearing loss was previously thought to be conductive and attributable to suppurative otitis media, chronic perforation in mastocytis, but SNHL also occurs. So in measles, you will have a bilateral hearing loss, whereas in mumps it is usually unilateral. So what happens to this measles decreases the immunity of the child, and that becomes a very good, like it becomes an opportunistic infection occurs, and this bacterial, and that leads to a suppurated bacterial infection leading to suppurative otitis media. So previously they were thinking the hearing loss was purely conductive, but now it has been seen that even sensorineural hearing loss also occurs with measles. Mumps, mostly unilateral, I have told you, and leads to severe to profound hearing loss. Autotoxic drugs, and the mechanism of action is by their action on the apoptotic pathway of cochleovestibular hair cells, where generation of reactive oxygen species is a rate limiting step. So here what happens is the autotoxicity, they have a wide range actually. What happens is some cause injury to the outer hair cell, some affect the basilar membrane, some even affect the stria vascularis. So some even affect the stria vascularis. Particularly if you are giving loop diuretics and all, they cause injury to stria vascularis, leading to reduced production of endolymph. Some cause directly injury to the outer hair cell by generation of reactive oxygen species. So it differs from a group of uh, drug to another group. So usually implicated are the, you can see the aminoglycoside group of drugs, particularly gentamicin, tobramycin, and even chemotherapeutic agents, particularly the cisplatin and carboplatin, zinc alkaloid, cyclophosphamide, and methotrexate, anti-malarials including chloroquine, diuretics, especially loop diuretics like furosemide and ethacranic acid, and iron chelators like desferrous. So they are notorious for causing injury to the cochlea, leading to sensorineural hearing loss. So third window disorder. So third window means what? Key. Normally we have two windows, the oval window and the round window. But in certain condition, there occurs a deficiency or a dehiscence. Dehiscence occur in the on the bony labyrinth. So this lead to formation of another additional window that is called as the third window. So these conditions are called the third window, and example include semicircular canal dehiscence. So maybe a, what to say, a superior semicircular canal dehiscence, or a dehiscence of the lateral semicircular canal, or an enlarged vestibular aqueduct, or X-linked Gusher syndrome, and dilated internal auditory meatus. So all these third window disorders, usually what happens in case of a dehiscent superior semicircular canal, no, although you see it is the pathology is occurring in the inner ear, that is in the superior semicircular canal, but here the hearing loss will be conductive in nature. So this you keep it in mind. In case of dehiscent superior semicircular canal, although the pathology occurs in the bony labyrinth, but this leads to a conductive hearing loss, like say fixation of the foot plate. So that occurs over the bony labyrinth, but it produces conductive hearing, unless and until it is a case of cochlear otosclerosis. then you have sensory neural hearing loss also. So clinical examination, all children with hearing loss of unknown cause should be evaluated for features associated with syndromic deafness. So now what they are doing at present scenario, I'm telling you here in ashram, particularly the child, those who are at risk babies, like let me give you 2-3 examples, like parent of consanguineous marriage. One. Number two is previous history of abortion. So these are what you say. You say are at risk babies. So already there is a history of abortion, and you know there is a consanguineous marriage, or you know that the mother has history of hypothyroidism and is not on drugs, or there is some history of anemia or history of hypertension, family history. All these are will be taken by the gynecology friend, and they will put it in the case sheet showing that this particular child which is in the womb of the mother is at risk. Then the whole follow-up of the mother uh, for the whole length of the pregnancy, starting with the most important thing here is documentation. So whatever small thing should be documented, and the register should be maintained by your gynecology colleague, so that this can be passed on to the fellow pediatrician after the delivery. So that helps a lot. So you maintain a notebook or a register in the name of the patient, and you note down all the things. Okay, and then including the delivery process also, whether it was a cesarean, if it is cesarean, why patient underwent cesarean section, was there any say a cord around the neck or meconium stain, or if it whether it was a premature delivery, or there was some problem uh, with the child or with the mother. So, so this, and then you remember that in majority of cases of hearing loss, it is non-syndromic in nature. Only one fifth of cases. That means, let us put it in that way, almost 80 to 90% are non-syndromic causes. Only 10% are syndromic in nature. So non-syndromic means the patient parents won't have any features, but and even the child also won't have any feature apart from deafness. Syndromic means all these things you will find, like there may be branchial cyst, fistula, you will find telecanthus, heterochromia, iridis, white forelock, pigmentary anomaly, high myopia, retinopathy, goiter. All this comes in syndromic hearing loss, which constitute hardly 10%. Like Waardenburg syndrome, Usher, Jervell, Lange-Nielsen, Pendred, Alport, Richard Collins. So a lot of them are there, but they only contribute 10% to it. But mostly it is non-syndromic. So in that case, the parents may be normal, and if you take history also, if it is a second child, they say our first child is absolutely normal. So majority you will find this. So audiological testing must be performed to assess the severity of hearing loss and to determine whether it is conductive, sensorineural, or mixed. So how to do? First, you have to do screening. Now, till the child grows to the age of 4 years or 5 years, where he or she can reliably respond to a pure tone audiometry, then that will be too late by that time. But nowadays there have been lot of screening procedures. Among them, the most important one is the autoacoustic emission. So we have already discussed about autoacoustic emission, and they autoacoustic emission, they see the integrity of the outer hair cell. If autoacoustic emission is say pass, then it indicates that mostly the child is having a normal hearing. But if one side, if it comes as a refer, then you have to go to a automated auditory brainstem response. Either you repeat the autoacoustic emission after 1 month. If still it is negative, then you go for a audiometry, brainstem response audiometry. So these I will not go into because already we have discussed between all these things. Then you can do a electrocochleography, which I have already told you. And these are then coming to the other things like the arousal test. So arousal test means a high frequency narrow band noise is presented for 2 seconds to the infant when he is in light sleep. A normal hearing infant can be aroused twice when 3 such stimuli are presented to him. So that indicates that the child is able to hear. Auditory response cradle is a screening device for newborn where the baby is placed in a cradle and his behavior in response to auditory stimulation are monitored by transducers. So once the baby goes into sleep, you fix all the gadgets to record the BP, to record the heart rate, to record the respiratory rate, to record the movement of the limbs and hand. And then suddenly you present a sufficiently loud sound, and then you do all the recordings. So if the child is able to hear, then obviously uh, the child will be taken by surprise. The heart rate will increase, the respiratory rate will increase, the BP will increase, there will be a movement of the muscles. But if the child is already born deaf, then there will be no such response. So this is a very good thing. Then you can do a behavioral observation audiometry, that is the key developmental age group from 0 to 6 months. So in behavioral observation audiometry, changes in activity are observed in response to sound stimulus. So usually the sound stimulus, you can know the child responds maximum to the mother's voice. So that is the voice which the child knows. So response behavior like eye widening, eye blink, alteration of sucking response, arousal from sleep, and then turning the head, turning the eye to the source of sound, turning the head to the source of sound. All these, by the time patient comes to you, all these things you should ask to the parents. All these things you should ask to the parents. So, and you remember the sound stimulus should be a sound stimulus which is known to the child, not any strange person coming and asking the child, calling out or making some sound. The child may not identify the sound, but the best is to use the mother's voice. Visual reinforcement audiometry, a key developmental age is 5 to 36 months. So in this period you can do. So it incorporates the principle that young children can be trained by operant conditioning to produce a localizing turn to a visual stimulus in response to a sound stimulus. So this test helps determine the hearing threshold using standard audiometric techniques. The first task must be to establish the conditioned response. Having drawn the child's attention to the front by gentle play activity on the table, a auditory signal should be presented concurrently with the visual reward. So while the child is playing with the person and sound is played, and then obviously if the child hears, then he or she will turn the head toward the direction of the sound. So from there you can know the threshold of hearing. So this is just to have a rough estimate. So once the child has demonstrated successful conditioning, the aim is to establish the minimal response level. So for each frequency. So a typical order of frequency, so this is not required. The test is well suited between the developmental age of 6 months to 1 year. So just 1 second. Uh, I'll show you this video. Uh, see, see that the child is being distracted by using the toys in front of him, and meanwhile you can see the sound is played. Again, she is bringing out the toys to distract the child's attention, and then again the sound will be played after some time. They are conditioning him now. Initially, they are conditioning the child. He, what is this? So he has to be conditioned to that, and they are keeping him engaged in other activities also. See, this is a visual reinforcement which is being given to the child. This needs a lot of patience on the part of the audiologist, because it's not easy to deal with the child. You have to have a lot of patience while doing this. See, the child, she is distracting her and with the toy, so that and then this sound is played, and, and the intensity is she is having the control in her hand. The control she has, she will modify, she will select the frequency, she will change the intensity also. All she can do, and the minimum intensity at which the child response is taken into consideration. So, so distraction, distraction test in the key developmental age is 6 to 18 months. The test is based on principle that the normal response observed when the sound is presented to an infant is a head turn to locate the source of sound. So the test environment is similar to that used for visual reinforcement audiometry. So here two testers are required, one to present the sound stimuli out of vision, and the other to control the infant or child attention in forward direction. The second one is called the distractor. Here you see, this is a child sitting here, and the distractor is seated to the table in between. Parents are seated here. Another tester is standing right behind, and he is controlling the sound source, which is roughly 45 degree at an angle of 45 degree to the child, and but they are located. The child is facing in this direction, and here the sound level meter on stand is there, and the frequency and decibel are controlled by him. So then they see for the response. Performance, the age is 2 to 5 years. The child is conditioned to perform an act such as placing a marble in a box, or putting a ring on a post, or putting a plastic block in a bucket each time he hears a sound signal. Each correct performance of the act is reinforced with praise, encouragement, or reward. So here specific thresholds can be determined by standard audiometric techniques. So once, this is just to have a rough estimate. Okay, is it clear to you?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello? Just hold on, I'm taking your attendance. It's not getting saved. When I'm saving it, no, here, file name, it's not getting saved. Archive record.